Life Inside a Texas Prison, a factual prison documentary. On March 15, 2019, at 2:47 a.m., Correctional Officer Daniel Martinez made a decision that would cost him everything. He had worked at the Ramsey Unit in Overcrowding, Texas for 11 years, long enough to know that some doors should never be opened alone. But that night, with the unit understaffed and a violent inmate claiming a medical emergency in cell block D, Martinez broke protocol. He had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of that steel door. What happened in the next 8 minutes would expose a hidden world that exists behind the walls of Texas prisons, a world of brutal hierarchies, impossible choices, and a survival code that makes the streets look tame. Martinez survived that night, but barely. The inmate who attacked him, Marcus "Ghost" Williams, had spent 14 years learning how to navigate a system that grinds down even the strongest. Ghost didn't plan to kill Martinez. He just needed him out of the way for what came next. But to understand how a decorated officer ended up fighting for his life, and why Ghost risked adding decades to his sentence, we need to go back. We need to look at what life inside a Texas prison really means, not the sanitized version they show on prison tours, but the raw truth that inmates and guards live every single day. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice operates over 100 facilities, housing more than 135,000 inmates. It's the largest prison system in the United States, a sprawling empire of concrete and razor wire that stretches from the Louisiana border to the deserts of West Texas. The Ramsey Unit, where our story unfolds, sits 30 miles south of Houston, a maximum security facility known among inmates as the Hammer. Daniel Martinez wasn't supposed to be a prison guard. He'd studied engineering at community college, had plans for a different life. But when his father got sick in 2008 and the bills started piling up, he took a job with the state. The pay was steady, the benefits were good, and he told himself it was temporary. 11 years later, he was still there, walking the same concrete corridors, breathing the same recycled air that smelled of industrial cleaner and something darker, fear, maybe, or desperation. Marcus Williams arrived at Ramsey in 2005, a 23-year-old kid from South Dallas with a 15-year sentence for armed robbery. He wasn't a killer when he went in. According to court documents, Marcus held up a convenience store with an unloaded gun, desperate to pay his grandmother's medical bills. First offense: bad lawyer. Maximum sentence. By the time he met Martinez that night in 2019, Marcus had evolved into something else entirely. Prison had a way of doing that, taking whatever you were and reshaping you into what you needed to become to survive. The Ramsey Unit houses 2,000 men in a space designed for 1,500. Cells built for one man hold 2, sometimes 3. The temperature in the Texas summer reaches over 100 degrees, and many units don't have air conditioning. Inmates sleep on steel bunks, their belongings stored in plastic crates. The walls are painted industrial beige, a color specifically chosen because studies showed it reduced aggression. It doesn't work. Looking back, there were signs no one noticed. In the weeks before that March night, tensions had been escalating in cell block D. A power shift was happening, the kind that happens when old debts come due and old alliances crumble. Guards reported more fights, more contraband, more of that electric charge in the air that seasoned officers recognize as the prelude to something big. But the prison was understaffed, overtime was mandatory, and exhausted guards missed what was building right in front of them. Martinez had noticed Ghost watching him. Not threatening, just observing, learning his patterns, his habits, which rules he enforced strictly and which ones he let slide. In prison, information is currency, and Ghost was a careful investor. He knew that Martinez always responded to medical emergencies alone because he didn't want to wake the other guards during graveyard shift. He knew Martinez was decent, that he'd bend the rules slightly for an inmate having a genuine crisis. Ghost was counting on that decency. Everything changed on March 14, 2019. That's when word spread through cell block D that someone was coming to collect. A debt 20 years in the making was about to be paid, and Ghost had to make a choice: let it happen and become a target himself, or intervene and risk everything he'd built. What happened next would reveal the unwritten code that governs life inside, a code more powerful than any law written by the state. The emergency call button in cell 47 lit up Martinez's control panel at 2:43 a.m. Ghost's cellmate was claiming chest pains, difficulty breathing, classic heart attack symptoms. The prison medical unit was in another building, a 5-minute walk through 2 secured corridors. Protocol dictated that Martinez should call for backup before opening any cell after midnight. But Ghost's cellmate, a 58-year-old man named Robert Chen, had diabetes and a heart condition. Minutes mattered. Martinez radioed that he was responding to a medical emergency and grabbed his equipment belt. He checked his radio, his pepper spray, made sure his panic button was functional. He'd opened cells alone before, hundreds of times. This felt routine. Cell Block D at night is a particular kind of quiet. 200 men breathing, shifting, some sleeping, some wide awake in the darkness. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that greenish institutional glow. Martinez's footsteps echoed on the concrete as he walked down the corridor towards cell 47. He looked through the small window. Chen was on the floor, Ghost kneeling beside him, apparently trying to help. What Martinez couldn't see was the third man, pressed flat against the wall beside the door. An inmate named James Ace Peterson, who shouldn't have been in that cell at all. Martinez opened the door at 2:47 a.m. exactly. Security footage would later show everything that happened, though the video had no sound. Martinez stepped inside, immediately moving toward Chen. That's when Peterson moved. Not attacking, not yet. Just blocking the door. Martinez spun around and that's when he saw Ghost stand up, and Martinez understood. His hand went to his radio, but Ghost was already talking, hands up, voice calm. They just needed to talk. They needed him to understand something. What happened in those next moments still generates debate. According to Martinez's testimony, Ghost explained that another inmate, a gang enforcer named Rafael Cortez, was planning to kill Chen that night over a debt from 2 decades ago, before either man was at Ramsey. Chen had testified against Cortez's brother in a murder trial in 1998. The brother got the death penalty. Cortez had waited 21 years for them to end up in the same prison. Tonight was collection night. Martinez faced an impossible choice. If he called for backup, the situation would escalate, and in the chaos, Chen might die anyway. If he did nothing, he was allowing inmates to manipulate him, breaking every rule in the book. But Ghost wasn't asking him to do nothing. Ghost was asking him to move Chen to protective custody, to save his life. All Martinez had to do was report a different reason, a fight, a threat, anything that would justify the transfer. The irony was thick. Ghost was asking a guard to bend the rules to prevent a murder. Ghost himself had 15 years on his sentence, but he'd done something unusual in prison. He'd refused to join any gang, refused to participate in the violence that defined life inside. According to court records from his multiple disciplinary hearings, Ghost had stopped 3 separate assaults, always as a mediator, never as an aggressor. Other inmates called him soft. He called it survival with a conscience. But what happened next would change everything. Martinez made his decision. He would help Chen, but he'd do it by the book. He reached for his radio to call it in properly. That's when Ace Peterson panicked. Peterson was 19 years old, serving time for a drug charge, and he'd been pressed into this situation by men who'd eat him alive if he failed. When Martinez reached for that radio, Peterson saw his own death warrant. He grabbed Martinez from behind. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes, but prison fights operate on a different clock. Every second stretches. Martinez was trained, but he was also 52 years old and fighting 2 men in a 6x9 cell. Ghost didn't join in. Security footage shows him actually trying to pull Peterson off Martinez at one point. But Peterson was terrified, and terrified 19-year-olds don't listen to reason. Martinez hit his panic button. Then he hit it again. The battery was dead. The prison was understaffed, and maintenance on equipment was months behind. Martinez fought, and he was losing. Peterson had his arm around Martinez's throat. The guard's vision was tunneling, darkness creeping in from the edges. He thought about his wife, his 2 daughters. He thought this was how it ended, on a concrete floor at 2:53 a.m., killed by a kid young enough to be his son. That's when Ghost made his choice. He pulled Peterson off Martinez, slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack the cinder block. Ghost looked at Martinez and said 3 words that the guard would repeat in every interview, every deposition, every nightmare: go. Get help. By the time backup arrived 4 minutes later, the situation had spiraled completely out of control. Other inmates were shouting, banging on their cells. Rafael Cortez was demanding to know what was happening. And in cell 47, Martinez was calling for medical while Ghost and Peterson were on the ground, hands behind their heads, waiting for the punishment they both knew was coming. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice investigation began within hours. When a correctional officer is attacked, the response is massive and uncompromising. Cell Block D was locked down completely. Every inmate was strip-searched, every cell tossed. They found contraband, of course, they always do, but they also found something else. They found a network. According to investigation reports obtained through public records requests, Chen had been marked for death for 3 weeks. Messages had been passed through the elaborate communication system inmates develop, notes in library books, codes in letters, whispers during recreation time. Cortez had been planning this since Chen transferred to Ramsey 6 months earlier. Ghost had learned about it only days before and had been desperately trying to find a way to stop it without getting himself killed. The evidence painted a complicated picture. Security footage showed that Ghost didn't attack Martinez. In fact, he prevented worse injury. But he'd also orchestrated the entire situation, manipulated a guard, violated protocols. Peterson claimed Ghost forced him into it, that he was threatened. Ghost claimed Peterson volunteered. Chen confirmed Ghost had warned him days earlier, had told him to request protective custody through official channels. But Chen had refused. He'd lived with the threat for 21 years and wasn't about to admit fear now. Investigators couldn't understand how Ghost knew. The answer revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that exists in any large prison. Inmates talk to family members on the outside who talk to other family members who talk to other inmates. Letters were steamed open, read, resealed. Ghost's cellmate's cousin worked at the prison where Cortez served his original sentence. Information flowed through channels the prison system didn't even know existed. But the story doesn't end there. The investigation uncovered something else, something the Texas Department of Criminal Justice tried to keep quiet. In the previous 18 months, Ramsey Unit had reported 15 serious assaults, 3 of which resulted in inmate deaths. Official reports attributed these to gang violence, unavoidable in a maximum security facility. But when investigators started digging, they found a pattern. Understaffing, neglected equipment, guards working triple overtime. The panic button that failed in cell 47? It had been reported broken 2 months earlier. The repair request was lost in bureaucracy. Martinez spent 3 days in the hospital with bruised ribs, a concussion, and significant soft tissue damage to his throat. He returned to work 2 months later, but he wasn't the same. In interviews with journalists, Martinez described a changed relationship with the inmates. He'd always seen himself as fundamentally different from them. He wore a uniform, carried keys, went home at the end of his shift. But that night, he and Ghost had something in common. They'd both tried to save a life in a system that made doing the right thing almost impossible. The public reaction was predictable and divided. Police unions demanded maximum sentences for Ghost and Peterson. Prison reform advocates pointed to Martinez's testimony that Ghost had saved his life. Conservative politicians used the incident to argue for more funding for the prison system. Progressive politicians used the same incident to argue the system was broken beyond repair. Everyone found what they wanted to find in the story. The moral complexity deepened when Chen himself testified. At Ghost's disciplinary hearing, Chen told the board that Ghost had been his only friend in the unit, that Ghost had taught him how to navigate the social hierarchies, how to avoid trouble. Chen said Ghost had saved his life multiple times, not just that night, but over months of quiet interventions that never made it into any report. The hearing board listened politely and then ignored every word. The system doesn't have a category for inmates who do the right thing for the wrong reasons. If officials had properly staffed the unit, if the panic button had been repaired, if Chen had been moved when Ghost first warned them through official channels, any one of these things might have prevented that night. But the Texas prison system, like most in America, operates on crisis management rather than prevention. Resources flow toward incidents after they happen, not toward stopping them before they start. Cortez, meanwhile, was transferred to administrative segregation, solitary confinement. He spent 23 hours a day in a cell barely large enough to extend his arms. According to his legal filings, he maintained he was within his rights to seek retribution against the man who had destroyed his brother's life. The prison system disagreed, but only about his methods, not his grievance. They just wanted him contained, where he couldn't cause more problems. What investigators never determined was how many other similar situations exist throughout the system. How many debts are waiting to be collected? How many inmates are trying to prevent violence while appearing to participate in it? How many guards are one broken panic button away from being in Martinez's position? The investigation answered the questions about that one night but opened dozens of others that no one wanted to examine too closely. The truth was far darker than anyone imagined. The incident in cell 47 wasn't an aberration. It was just the moment when the invisible became visible, when the daily reality of prison life broke through into public view. And what came next would test whether the system could acknowledge its failures or would simply bury them under paperwork and bureaucracy. Ghost was sentenced to an additional 7 years for his role in the incident. Despite Martinez's testimony, despite Chen's advocacy, the disciplinary board had no mechanism to account for good intentions wrapped in rule-breaking. Peterson got 5 years added to his sentence. Both men were transferred to different facilities, separated from everyone they knew. In prison, that's one of the worst punishments, starting over in a new yard, with new rules, new hierarchies, new threats. Life at the Ramsey Unit continued. New inmates arrived, old inmates transferred out or went home. But for those who were there that night, something had shifted. The guards walked the corridors differently, more alert to the invisible currents that moved beneath the surface. The inmates talked about Ghost in the way they talk about legends, a story that gets embellished with each telling until it's hard to separate truth from mythology. Daily reality in a Texas maximum security prison operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the official level, the schedule, the rules, the procedures spelled out in the handbook that every inmate receives and almost no one reads. Then there's the actual level, where the real rules are negotiated through a complex system of respect, reputation, and violence. Inmates at Ramsey wake at 5:30 a.m. to a buzzer that sounds like the end of the world. They have 15 minutes to clean their cells, get dressed, and be ready for count. Guards walk the tiers, counting bodies, checking pulses, making sure nobody died in the night. It happens more often than you'd think: heart attacks, diabetes complications, sometimes suicide, sometimes murder disguised as suicide. Breakfast is at 6. The mess hall holds 500 men, serves over 1,500 meals in shifts. The food is technically nutritious, carefully designed to meet federal guidelines for caloric intake and vitamin content. It tastes like cardboard soaked in motor oil. Inmates who have money in their commissary account supplement with ramen noodles, chips, cookies. Those without money eat what's provided and are always hungry. The psychological impact of confinement reveals itself in stages. The first year, inmates maintain their outside identity. They talk about life before, make plans for after. They believe they are just visiting this place, that they are not really prisoners, just people temporarily stuck in prison. The second year, that belief cracks. The third year, it shatters. By year 5, if you're not careful, you forget there was ever anything else. Ghost told a social worker, in a conversation documented in his prison file, that the hardest part wasn't the violence or the fear or even the boredom. The hardest part was maintaining your humanity in a place specifically designed to strip it away. Prison rules are built on dehumanization. You're not Marcus Williams anymore. You're inmate number 1445872. You don't have privacy. You don't have autonomy. You don't have dignity unless you fight for it every single day, and sometimes fighting for dignity means violating the very humanity you're trying to preserve. Survival tactics in a place like Ramsey are sophisticated and brutal. You need allies, but you can't trust anyone completely. You need to establish boundaries, what you will and won't do, but you also need to be flexible enough to adapt when circumstances change. You learn to read situations, to sense when violence is coming the way animals sense earthquakes. You develop hyper-awareness, sleeping with one eye open, waking at the smallest unusual sound. Ghost's particular approach, refusing gang affiliation, acting as a mediator, was unusual and dangerous. Gangs provide protection, structure, identity. By refusing to join, Ghost marked himself as an outsider, potentially an enemy to all sides. But he'd made a calculation. Gang members serve their gang first, themselves second. Ghost had watched gang members get pressured into violence they didn't want, debts they couldn't pay. He'd seen the toll it took. He decided that surviving alone, even if harder, left him more human at the end. Relationships in prison exist in a strange suspended state. Friendships form quickly, intensely. When you're surrounded by 2,000 men and trust only 3, those 3 become your world. But those relationships are also transactional. Everyone needs something. The key is ensuring that what you need and what you provide stays balanced. Chen and Ghost had that balance. Chen had education, connections, respect from the older inmates. Ghost had youth, physical capability, and an instinct for reading people. They protected each other, but neither forgot they were in prison. Real friendship requires trust. Prison requires caution. They lived in the overlap. Ongoing struggles define long-term incarceration. Ghost's family stopped visiting after the second year. Too far, too expensive, too painful. His mother wrote for a while, but the letters became less frequent, then stopped. His sister sent money to his commissary account on his birthday and at Christmas. It was enough to buy ramen and chips, not enough to buy real comfort. Most inmates at Ramsey have similar stories. The outside world moves on. The people who loved you still love you, but life doesn't stop while you serve your time. The mental health crisis in American prisons is well documented, though rarely addressed. At Ramsey, there's one psychologist for 2,000 inmates. Therapy means a 15-minute conversation every 6 months if you're lucky. Medication is available for serious cases, but the pills come with side effects: lethargy, weight gain, emotional flattening. Some inmates take them anyway. Others refuse, preferring genuine suffering to medicated numbness. Ghost's disciplinary record showed a pattern. Before the incident with Martinez, he'd been written up 17 times in 14 years. But the violations were strange: intervening in fights between other inmates, unauthorized presence in other cell blocks, possession of notes containing information about planned assaults. Each time, he claimed he was trying to prevent violence. Each time, he was punished for breaking the rules used to prevent violence. The system couldn't process someone who saw a problem and tried to fix it rather than reporting it and walking away. One shocking detail that emerged during the investigation: Ghost had contacted prison officials through official channels 14 times in the 3 weeks before the Martinez incident, trying to warn them about the threat to Chen. Each time, his concerns were noted and filed. No action was taken. The prison system receives thousands of warnings from inmates, most of them manipulation or paranoia. Sorting the real threats from the noise is impossible with current staffing levels. So officials default to reacting rather than preventing. Ghost understood this, which is why he eventually took matters into his own hands. After 3 years in his new facility, something unexpected happened. Ghost received a letter from Martinez. The guard had been thinking about that night, about the choice Ghost made to pull Peterson off him instead of letting him die. Martinez wanted Ghost to know it mattered, that he testified at every parole hearing, every appeal, every review. He couldn't undo the 7 additional years, but he could make sure the record showed the complete truth. The letter was brief, formal, but it said something important: I see you as human. In prison, that's everything. In November 2023, 4 years after the incident, new evidence emerged that changed the narrative. A former gang member at Ramsey, granted early release and immunity for cooperation, provided testimony about the night in cell 47. According to this testimony, Ghost had been under threat himself. A rival faction had ordered him to facilitate Chen's murder or face retaliation. By orchestrating Martinez's involvement, Ghost had simultaneously saved Chen and provided himself with an alibi. He could tell the gang he tried, but the guard intervened. This revelation complicated everything. Was Ghost a hero who saved 2 lives at great personal cost? Or was he a manipulator who played all sides, using Martinez as an unwitting pawn? Court documents from Ghost's appeal, filed in 2024, argue both things can be true. Ghost made strategic choices to survive in an impossible situation, and those choices happened to result in people not dying. Motive doesn't negate outcome. Peterson's story took a different turn. He was released in December 2024 after serving his additional time. In interviews with a criminal justice reform podcast, Peterson described the 19-year-old kid who attacked a guard as someone he no longer recognizes. He'd entered prison for a low-level drug offense. He left having learned that violence is communication, that fear is leverage, that survival sometimes means hurting people who don't deserve it. The system had worked exactly as designed, he said, if the design was to make people worse. Chen was released in January 2025 after serving 26 years for his original conviction. He walked out of prison at age 64 with $400, the clothes on his back, and no one waiting for him. His sister had offered to let him stay with her in Austin, but the terms of his parole required him to remain in the Houston area. According to his parole officer, Chen was adjusting, finding work, attending counseling, trying to rebuild a life from nothing. But he told a reporter something haunting: he felt safer in prison. The world had changed so much in 26 years that he didn't understand how it worked anymore. In prison, at least he knew the rules. Martinez left the Texas Department of Criminal Justice in 2021. He took a job as a consultant for prison reform organizations, using his experience to advocate for better staffing, better training, better equipment. He testified before the Texas legislature about the panic button that failed, about the ways the system puts both guards and inmates in danger through neglect and underfunding. The committee thanked him for his service and passed none of the recommended reforms. Ghost remains incarcerated. His earliest possible release date is now March 2033, 14 years from the night he made a choice that saved 2 lives and cost him 7 years of freedom. His appeals have been denied at every level. The Texas criminal justice system recognizes redemption in theory but not in practice. Once you've violated the rules, your motive doesn't matter. The system sees only the violation. To this day, no one knows why Cortez waited 21 years to act on his brother's death. The question haunts Chen, who wonders whether showing up at the same prison was truly coincidence or whether forces he doesn't understand were maneuvering them into position. Ghost, in a rare interview with a prison reform journalist, suggested that Cortez was simply waiting for the moment when Chen's guard was down, when he felt safe. The most effective violence, Ghost said, comes when you think you've escaped it. The ongoing impact of that March night ripples through the system still. Ramsey Unit received increased funding for equipment maintenance. Panic buttons are now tested weekly instead of monthly. But staffing levels haven't changed. The fundamental problems that created the situation remain unaddressed. Officials held press conferences, announced reforms, then quietly shelved them when the public stopped paying attention. That's how the system survives, by outlasting scrutiny. Victim perspective in this case is complicated because there are multiple victims. Martinez was attacked. Ghost lost 7 years. Chen spent 26 years waiting to die. Peterson became someone he never intended to be. Even Cortez, in his own twisted way, was a victim of a system that didn't address his trauma, that left him to carry his rage for 2 decades until it metastasized into murder. American prisons don't heal trauma. They compound it, multiply it, spread it like a virus through every person they touch. Was justice served? Martinez says no. Ghost should have received commendation, not additional time. Prison reform advocates say no. The system that created this situation remains unchanged. The prison administration says yes, rules were broken, consequences were applied, order was restored. Chen says he doesn't know, he's alive because Ghost broke the rules, but Peterson's life was ruined because of the same decision. Maybe justice isn't something that gets served. Maybe it's just the story we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. The story of what happened in Cell 47 at the Ramsey Unit reveals a truth about the American prison system that we spend enormous energy trying to ignore. We've built a massive infrastructure of punishment, over 2 million people incarcerated, more than any nation in history, but we've created no corresponding infrastructure of humanity. We've designed a system that demands impossible choices and then punishes people for making them. Ghost's current status is inmate in good standing at a facility in East Texas. He works in the prison library, helps other inmates with their legal appeals, and waits for 2033. Martinez conducts training sessions for new correctional officers, teaching them to trust their instincts, to see inmates as humans facing impossible situations, to understand that the badge doesn't make them fundamentally different from the people they are guarding. Peterson is trying to navigate a world that changed while he was away, carrying trauma the system inflicted and then released into the community. Chen is alone in a halfway house in Houston, 74 years old, wondering whether freedom was worth waiting for. The lessons from this case are uncomfortable because they require us to acknowledge complexity. It's easier to divide the world into criminals and law-abiding citizens, into good people and bad people. But prison reveals the fragility of those categories. Good people make terrible choices under pressure. Bad people can choose redemption even when the system offers no path toward it. The guard and the inmate, in that cell at 2:47 a.m., were just two men trying to prevent a death in a system built on calculated indifference. The broader meaning here cuts to the heart of how we think about punishment and rehabilitation. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world because we've made a collective decision that punishment is the solution to social problems. We imprison people for drugs, for poverty, for mental illness, for making desperate choices in impossible circumstances. Then we're surprised when they emerge damaged, when they've learned that violence works, when they're worse than when they went in. One final haunting detail from Ghost's prison file. In his quarterly psychological evaluation, the counselor asked what he'd do differently if he could go back to March 2019. Ghost thought for a long time. Then he said he'd do exactly the same thing. Not because it was smart or because it worked out, it didn't. But because Chen was going to die, and Ghost couldn't live with himself if he'd done nothing. Even knowing it would cost him 7 years, even knowing the system would punish him for trying to save a life, he'd make the same choice. That's humanity in its purest form, choosing to do right even when wrong is easier and safer. The question we're left with is this: what does it say about our society that we've built a system where doing the right thing makes you a target, where guards can't keep themselves safe, where inmates who refuse to participate in violence are considered weak rather than strong? What does it say that we spend billions on punishment but almost nothing on the infrastructure of redemption? What does it say that Ghost will serve until 2033 for preventing 2 deaths while the system that failed its basic duty to protect faces no consequences at all? This channel covers the cases and the issues that reveal uncomfortable truths about the criminal justice system. Real stories from inside the system, told with the complexity they deserve. If you want to understand how the system actually works, not how we pretend it works, subscribe for weekly investigations. Next week, I'm covering the story of a wrongful conviction that took 30 years to overturn and the prosecutor who knew the entire time. It's a case that will make you question everything you believe about justice in America. But for now, think about Ghost, sitting in a prison library in East Texas, helping other inmates fight their cases, waiting for 2033. Think about Martinez, teaching new guards that the inmates are human, knowing most of them will forget that lesson within a month. Think about Chen, free at last, terrified of the freedom he spent 26 years dreaming about. And ask yourself, is this justice? Or is it just revenge with paperwork? Share this story if it made you think. Comment below, do you think Ghost deserved 7 additional years for saving 2 lives? What would you have done in his situation? What would you have done in Martinez's? These are the questions we have to ask if we're ever going to build something better than what we have. This is the conversation we need to have. The system won't change until we refuse to look away from what it actually does. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.